The mid-major Heisman candidate is something that doesn't happen super often, but when it does, it's a moment that college football fans feel like they have to tune into because who knows when it'll happen again. Especially now in the era of the transfer portal and NIL, it's easy for the best players in the country to leave their mid-major schools to go somewhere for a bigger opportunity, and you can't really blame them for it. But the 2024 college football season has given us a pretty insane Heisman race so far, with the biggest names in the country at the top of the watch list. And in terms of group of 5 representation, it includes a running back from the Mountain West that is putting together one of the greatest seasons in college football history while running on blue turf. My name is Caleb, and the mid-major Heisman candidate is a rare but welcome sight. Ashton Jeanty out of Boise State has solidified himself as the best running back in the country this season and is making a real case to win the Heisman this year. Boise State for at least the last decade and a half has been one of the best G5 programs in the country, and it's never a surprise when they have a really fun offense. But this season, Ashton Jeanty is the offense. His season so far has made me want to go back to revisit some other notable mid-major Heisman candidates from the last 30 years or so, and revisit their cases to see what type of seasons they had to have to actually become a candidate. Today we'll go over Jeanty's season so far, 3 former mid-major Heisman candidates, and whether history is on Jeanty's side to actually win the award. Make sure to like and subscribe for more videos like this, and with that being said, let's jump in. What Ashton Jeanty is doing at Boise State this year is something we haven't seen in college football since at least Barry Sanders. Coming off a Mountain West Offensive Player of the Year in 2023, it was expected that he would have at least another season on par to that. But to have a 1,000-yard season before even getting 100 carries is just scratching the surface on how historic his first half of the season has been. He's currently on pace to break Sanders' rushing record, and say what you want about him playing in the Mountain West or the competition he's playing this year, but anybody putting up those numbers he is in the FBS should be in consideration for the Heisman regardless. As of the making of this video, Boise State is 5-1 and tied for first in the Mountain West with UNLV, and it's going to be those two teams making their case for the college football playoff for the rest of the season. Just from a statistical standpoint, Jeanty has already almost surpassed his entire rushing total from last season, going for over 1,200 yards in 6 games, and he's already beaten his career high in rushing touchdowns with 17. I mean, he opened the season with a 267-yard, 6-touchdown game against Georgia Southern, and it was a sign of what was to come. On 10 yards per carry, he's pretty much carried this Boise State offense to these blowout wins, and in their one loss to Oregon, he almost single-handedly beat one of the best teams in the country. I think the Oregon game should quiet some of the competition talk because in a game where they were favored to lose by over 2 touchdowns, it only ended up being a 3-point loss in a game where Jeanty ran for 192 yards and 3 touchdowns and still averaged 7 yards a carry. The game came down to a game-winning field goal at the end of regulation where Boise State actually had the lead midway through the 4th. It was a great game, and I would recommend going back and watching it. And what was Jeanty's first time in the national spotlight this year? And when he's played in conference competition, he's barely been playing in the second half because he hasn't had to. 127 on 11 carries against Portland State, 259 and 4 TDs against Wazoo, 186 and 2 touchdowns against Utah State. And then he started slow against Hawaii last week, but still ended up with 217 yards and a touchdown. He's 100% a Heisman candidate without a question, but his competition is going to be tight. This is shaping up to be one of my favorite Heisman races ever, and the fact that Jeanty is getting this much push at a G5 school is in my opinion great for college football. And maybe not at this level, but we've seen some other candidates from smaller schools before, so let's talk about a few candidates from years prior that made a Heisman push at smaller schools. I know we talk about the rarity of G5 Heisman candidates, but Steve McNair is the most recent Heisman candidate to come out of an FCS school, and for good reason. We rarely ever think about the FCS when it comes to the Heisman race, so the fact that you have to be as good as McNair was to be considered is pretty wild. Everyone familiar with Eric McNair knows about his NFL career, 3-time Pro Bowler, 2003 NFL MVP. He also led the Titans to their first and only Super Bowl appearance in 1999, and as dynamic as he could be in the pros, he first showed off his play style in the HBCU grid at Alcorn State in the early 90s. At Alcorn State, McNair was immediately one of the best players in FCS football, at the time known as Division I AA. SWAC football is premier HBCU football with plenty of notable NFL alum coming from the conference, most notably Jerry Rice from Mississippi Valley and Walter Payton from Jackson State, just to name a few. And as a freshman in 1991, McNair wanted to etch his name into SWAC history as one of the greatest to ever play in the conference. He'd throw for over 2,800 yards and 24 touchdowns, a solid freshman year that landed him a first-team all-conference nod, Offensive Player of the Year, and SWAC Freshman of the Year. He'd already established himself as the best quarterback in the conference as he'd win SWAC Offensive Player of the Year again in 92 and 93, along with 2 more all-conference teams. He's one of the most prolific passers in the country and one of the best dual threat quarterbacks in the country as well, as his rushing numbers continued to rise each season. He was just too good to ignore, and his 1994 Heisman candidacy is one of the best ever, FCS or FBS alike. Even back then, a lot of the media acknowledged that playing with Division I AA probably would not garner McNair a lot of votes because of the competition level, but there's no denying a flat-out dominant football player on any level. In 1994, Steve McNair put the college football world on notice, as he had NFL scouts lined up in Lorman, Mississippi of all places to watch him play football and evaluate him for the next level. In his very first game that season against Grambling State, he put up 633 yards, 534 through the air, and 5 touchdowns. That type of game is going to get you attention anywhere, and a few weeks later, after a few more dominant games, he landed the cover of Sports Illustrated, legitimizing his Heisman hopes. By October that season, McNair was on pace to break former Heisman winner Ty Detman's record of the NCAA's all-time leader in total offense of 14,655 yards in front of a crowd that was estimated to be over 5,000 more people than the stadium's capacity. And that crowd got to witness a record-breaking performance, a record that McNair still holds to this day, as he'd finish his career with 17,305 yards of total offense in his college career. McNair's 1994 season saw him finish with just under 6,300 yards of offense, with 5,300 through the air and 900 on the ground. He had 6 games of 500 yards passing and led his team to the FCS playoffs. His season got him an invite to New York, where he finished 3rd in Heisman voting, just behind Penn State's Kajana Carter and Heisman winner Rashaan Salaam. McNair is the closest FCS player to win the Heisman in modern college football history, and nobody has come close since. He'd go on to have a great NFL career after being taken 3rd overall by the Oilers in '96, but he's easily one of the greatest college football players ever and carried HBCU football on his back in the '90s. Randy Moss's name always comes up when discussing the greatest receivers of all time, and it follows suit that a lot of them came from mid-major schools. But his journey to becoming a rare mid-major Heisman candidate actually didn't start in Marshall, as his talent alone had originally landed him at 2 iconic programs. Little known fact about Randy Moss, he was actually committed to Notre Dame out of high school, and then because of legal trouble, had to go enroll at Florida State and redshirted his freshman year. But he never actually played a game for the Seminoles, as he'd be dismissed from the team after a failed drug test. It would have been interesting to see him play with those great Noles teams of the mid-90s, definitely a huge what if. But after leaving Tallahassee, he transferred to Marshall to be closer to his hometown of DuPont City, West Virginia. Marshall was Division I AA at the time, but were in their last season of that division, planning to make the jump to what we now know as the FBS in 1997. In Moss's first year on the field, he set college football on fire and immediately out the gate set the record for most receiving yards by a freshman with just over 1,700, a record that he still holds to this day. To go along with 28 touchdowns, he and quarterback Chad Pennington led Marshall to an undefeated record and Division I AA championship. After showing the world that despite his off-the-field issues, he was indeed one of the best receivers in the country, it was time to show he could play in the higher division during Marshall's first FBS season in 1997. They joined the Mid-American Conference and were peak late 90s Maction. Moss and Marshall picked up right where they left off. In their first FBS season, Marshall would post a 10-3 record, going 7-1 in the MAC, where Moss put together his Heisman campaign. After starting the year with an 85-yard, 2-touchdown game versus West Virginia, Moss torched Army for 186 yards and 2 touchdowns on 5 catches, which set the tone for the rest of the season. His 1997 magnum opus came in a blowout win at Ball State in Muncie, where he put up 205 yards and 5 touchdowns, setting a school record. On 96 catches and 1,800 yards, he'd add 26 touchdowns and was easily the best receiver in college football that season. His average touchdown catch that year came out to around 35 yards a catch. It was a shoo-in for the Biletnikoff Award and a unanimous All-American. Moss, along with the 1997 Heisman finalists of Charles Woodson, Peyton Manning, and Ryan Leaf, is known as one of, if not the greatest Heisman race in college football history. As a small-town kid who, in his words, had never been on TV before without pads and a helmet, Moss showed up to the presentation in New York City in a cool pair of shades. Though Moss had one of the most dominant receiver seasons ever, he wasn't very confident that he'd win it, noting the bias the selection committee had for bigger schools. Moss would finish 4th in Heisman voting, and Charles Woodson would take home the award after also having one of the greatest college football seasons ever, playing both sides of the ball. We know Moss would go on to have a Hall of Fame career in the NFL, and to most football fans, he's a top 2 receiver at the most and top 5 at the least all time. And Moss's Heisman candidacy in 1997 at Marshall is one of the most unique because I can't think of many other players who made such a dominant jump from FCS to FBS in their first year in that division. Speaking of MAC football, you had to be there for Jordan Lynch, the NIU legend, one of the most unlikely Heisman candidates in my lifetime, and just one of the most fun quarterbacks in college football at the time. As the most recent non-power conference Heisman candidate, I had to include him in this video and talk about his legendary 2013 season. Out of every entry in this video, Lynch was maybe the most unlikely player to receive a Heisman case. He wasn't a highly rated recruit coming out of high school in Chicago, and in his first 2 seasons at Northern Illinois, he'd back up Chandler Harnish, who himself had a great college career. But when he did see the field, he was noted for his rushing ability as a quarterback, as the team would use different offensive packages that allowed him to use his legs and keep opposing defenses on their toes. When he finally got the chance to start in 2012, he took full advantage of the opportunity and led the Huskies to a 12-2 record, a MAC championship, and a New Year's Six Bowl appearance where they faced off against Florida State in the Orange Bowl. He'd also go second-team All-American after he broke the single-season rushing record by a quarterback with an insane 1,800 yards on the ground and 19 touchdowns. On top of his 3,100 passing yards to go along with 25 touchdowns through the air, he'd finish 7th in Heisman voting, and while he didn't receive the invite to New York, he'd make sure his 2013 season got him a spot near the top of the list when the time came. Unlike his previous season, Lynch started the year on Heisman watch list, and rightfully so. He entered the year as must-see TV, and on the best team in the MAC, Lynch would dominate the competition every single Saturday. He started the year with a Power Conference win over Iowa, where he scored 5 total touchdowns, in a win that got them on the AP poll, where they'd stay throughout the rest of the season. Lynch legitimately ran over the MAC conference, as he'd break his own single-season rushing record as a quarterback with just over 1,900 yards and 23 touchdowns on the ground. This included 2 games with over 300 rushing yards against Central Michigan and Western Michigan respectively, and while his rushing performances are what really caught the eye, he was great through the air as well, throwing for just under 2,900 yards and 24 touchdowns. NIU would go undefeated in the regular season before a loss to Bowling Green in the MAC championship, and then a bowl loss to Utah State, but Lynch's heroic efforts wouldn't go unnoticed as he achieved the unthinkable and received his Heisman invite to New York. Though he'd finished 3rd behind winner Jameis Winston and Bama quarterback AJ McCarron, Lynch's 2013 season at NIU was truly electric. He'd end his career as a first-team All-American and win his second of 2 MAC MVPs and Offensive Player of the Years, cementing himself as one of the greatest players in conference history. Even though Lynch's game wasn't going to really translate to the NFL, he did spend some time in the CFL before hanging him up after the 2016 season, but found his calling in coaching as he's currently the head coach of his alma mater, Mount Carmel High School in Chicago. So is history on Jeanty's side to win the Heisman, seeing how other mid-major candidates have fared in the past? Right now the answer is probably no, but it has shown that it's not out of the question, and Ashton Jeanty may change that narrative and be the first mid-major player to win the award in modern college football. Should he continue his dominant season, I believe he'll have the best chance out of any mid-major candidate ever to be nominated for the award. So shout out to those rare mid-major Heisman candidates for mixing things up, and let me know your favorite mid-major Heisman candidate memories in the comments. My name is Caleb. If you want to support the channel, please like and subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next one.